executive producer Daniel Marin's guest hosting on the show this week. Joining us now in studio to talk about another fascinating aspect of this austerity debate is Sarah Anderson from the Institute for Policy Studies. Sarah is the director of Global Economy for the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS. You can follow her at @Anderson_IPS. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sarah, you co-authored a report that was released this week called Corporate Pirates of the Caribbean, in which you basically explain that this Fix the Debt coalition, representing many CEOs, stands to gain tremendously profit in the hundreds of billions of dollars from many of the same proposals that they're calling responsible deficit reduction. What specifically are we talking about?
What we're talking about is what's called a territorial tax reform. So these big companies, many of which are already shifting profits to tax haven countries to avoid paying their fair share of taxes here in the U.S., want to permanently exempt their foreign earnings from U.S. taxes. So it would give an even bigger incentive for them to be hiding their profits overseas and avoiding paying their fair share to Uncle Sam. And what we did is we looked at how much these companies have already accumulated in their offshore stashes. And based on that, we estimate that if they get this territorial tax reform through Congress, they stand to gain as much as $173 billion in tax windfalls.
And we're talking about something like 59 of the Fix the Debt companies, including companies like General Electric, which we know got a $3 billion tax rebate from the federal government last year. Companies like Honeywell, companies like United Parcel Service, John Deere, mammoth companies that make tons from United States consumers, from United States workers, and yet, as you're explaining right now, many of them, through accounting tricks, report their earnings overseas in places like Bermuda and Luxembourg. And one of the interesting things about the report was that you point out that in the overseas profits of these companies make up more than the entire GDP of Bermuda and Luxembourg, and yet they're reported as being earned there. It's kind of, it's really transparent, isn't it?
Yeah, it's completely outrageous. Companies like GE have armies of tax lawyers who work every day to figure out new tricks for avoiding paying their taxes here in the United States. And pushing for this territorial tax reform is just one more of these loopholes that they're going to use to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. And it's particularly galling when they're part of this group called Fix the Debt that's out there talking about how we should have shared sacrifice. We need to be responsible. You know, everyone needs to do their fair share to deal with this deficit problem. And yet, if you look at what their agenda really is, it's about getting more tax breaks, like this territorial tax reform, and then paying for them through cuts to Social Security and Medicare.
It's a fascinating perspective, Sarah, and I encourage everyone to check out the report, Corporate Pirates of the Caribbean. You're absolutely right in that these Fix the Debt groups, they claim that they're bipartisan, and the way that they do that is because they say we need more revenue. And then they talk about, well, you know, it's 2/3 spending cuts and 1/3 revenue. Of course, the deficit reduction up to this point has been 3/4 spending cuts. And the revenue they talk about is through this comprehensive tax reform system. And so I want to just try and give them their due, if you will, try and play out exactly what argument they're really making here. And that they're saying, currently, the actual the official corporate tax rate in the United States, the highest rate, is 35%. The effective rate, we know, it ranges from something like 10 to 15, rarely ever higher than 20. You've got a bad accountant if you got that. But their argument is essentially this. If you let us have amnesty on the money that we've been hiding right now overseas, by essentially allowing us to bring it home through this territorial tax system and say that if it was earned overseas, then it can go untaxed. If it was earned overseas, rather, or that'll be taxed at the rates that they have in those countries, and in many cases it's places like Bermuda that are tax havens. But then we'll bring the money home to our banks here, to where we hold our money here, and that will prompt us to reinvest it in jobs and business here, and ultimately that will somehow generate more revenue. They also say that if we're allowed to bring it home and then we lower the American U.S. corporate tax rate, then that will also encourage corporations to stop faking this reporting overseas, and they'll bring it home from overseas where it was going untaxed, and then they'll be willing to have it taxed in the U.S. because the tax rates are lower. But you basically point out that this is all voluntary, and there's just no record that because these things seem like they would encourage corporations to do that they actually will.
Exactly. And our past experience is just the opposite. So back in 2004, they made this argument then too. They said, oh, our money is being held hostage overseas because the tax rates in the U.S. are so high that we can't bring it back here. And if only the tax rates were lower, then we could bring this money back and use it to create good American jobs. And so they granted a temporary tax holiday, a deeply discounted tax rate for money that was brought back from these overseas pots. And what happened? The companies that took advantage of that tax break did not create jobs. In fact, many of them followed up with mass layoffs. And so this is just an empty argument. We've tried it before. They didn't use the money to create jobs here. It's just one more way for them to avoid paying taxes.
Now, I understand that the Fix the Debt Coalition is none too happy about your report, Corporate Pirates of the Caribbean, and they've expressed their displeasure. What exactly have they said?
Well, they said it was a bunch of lies, if I recall exactly. The head of Fix the Debt, Maya McGinnis, was quoted in the Huffington Post saying that. And they've also put out a press release now saying that we just don't understand that they haven't taken any clear positions on anything, especially on how to treat foreign income. And this is just another example of Fix the Debt being very slippery, because we copied and pasted into our report proof that they have on their own website materials promoting territorial tax reform. This is out of a PowerPoint that they have developed for the CEOs who are the members of this coalition to use for educational purposes to try to recruit more members. And it says very clearly that one of the budget needs that has to be addressed is a shift to a territorial tax reform. So it's right there on the Fix the Debt website. Anyone can go and look at it. And yet they're trying to play this game where most of their materials are very general and bland and hard to specify. And yet we know who's behind this campaign. Erskine Bowles are behind this, the co-founders of it. They're for territorial tax reform. The materials on their own website say they're for territorial tax reform and cutting Social Security and Medicare. And so we just shouldn't be fooled by their very slick advertising strategies and these, very aggressive statements by their spokespeople.
And in fact, I mean, this is what they've always done with their Social Security and Medicare cuts. They say, well, we haven't endorsed a specific plan, but they always limit the options to including deep Social Security and Medicare cuts. Yeah. They always get behind a tax reform plan that must have lower rates. That's one of their big things. Right. And I specifically remember during the Bowles-Simpson hearings, Erskine Bowles saying, we need to switch to more of a territorial system. So, I mean, this is one of their hobby horses. And you, the folks at Institute for Policy Studies, have been doing perhaps the most invaluable work in the entire country on it. Sarah Anderson, thank you so much for joining us on Take Action News and sharing this amazing report, shocking report.
Thanks for having me on. My pleasure.
When Take Action News continues, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the social media implications of the Edward Snowden leak. Are they really mining our data? And who's behind that weird Edward Snowden Twitter account? Well, that guy's going to be on the show in just a moment. When Take Action News continues after this.